Hello and welcome to Rockstar Manager. I'm Dr. K, the management professor, and this episode is about perception and the link to decision making. We'll walk through factors that create perception, common shortcuts in judging others, and links to decision making. Before we get started, please subscribe to my channel by hitting the subscribe button down below and also hit the notifications button so you'll see each time I post a new video. Perception is our interpretation of a situation. What we perceive can be substantially different than reality. Let's review 3 factors that break down perception. The first factor is the perceiver. It's fair to say that sometimes we see what we want to see and we hear what we want to hear, not necessarily because it's the truth, but because it's in line with our thinking. Here's a workplace example. It can be perceived that those who arrive early are high performers. And conversely, those who arrive late to work are lazy and or don't manage their time well. In reality, however, those who arrive early may have to drop children off at daycare and leave work early to pick them up. And those who are night owls and work until late hours are more likely to come in later. Just because you do something one way doesn't mean that everyone else does it that way too. Some factors that influence the perceiver are experience, attitudes, interests, and expectations. The second factor is the target. The characteristic of the target also plays a factor. Do we know the person? Is there a background? Is there a predetermined bias that categorizes you to think in a particular manner? For example, if you think of a professor in a lecture hall, oftentimes we think about him or her in a professional suit, groomed, and someone who looks like a person in a position of authority. But what if that professor, the target, if you will, in this scenario, is dressed in a t-shirt, shorts, and flip-flops? You may think this person is a student. The third and final factor is context. Our attention can be influenced by time of day, location, or other situational factors. Let's assume that you saw the professor at the grocery store dressed in that same manner, shorts and a t-shirt. You are really less likely to recognize it because you might expect people to be dressed that way in the middle of the summer. However, you recognize if your professor is dressed in that same manner in class because it catches your attention. People are usually not aware of the factors that influence their view of reality. Now let's talk about a handful of common shortcuts in judging others. First, we'll talk about selective perception. The tendency to choose to interpret what you see that's based on your own interests, background experiences, and attitudes is called selective perception. This isn't to say that we are conducting a negative action. It's impossible for us to assimilate everything that we see and can only take in so much. In general, we are drawn to things that we like. A generic example would be if you like particular cars, you're more likely to recognize them when you see one. Another common shortcut in judging others is what's called the halo effect or the horns effect, and these go hand in hand. The halo effect is our tendency to have a positive response or a positive general impression about someone based on a single characteristic. Conversely, the horns effect is the tendency to form a negative impression about someone based on a single characteristic. Think about someone who is super social. He or she smiles, talks to everyone in the room, shakes everyone's hand. What assumptions did you make? You likely wouldn't say that person was introverted. Does that mean that introverts can't do any of that? They may not feel as though that it's in their comfort zone, but being an introvert doesn't mean that you can't work a room. The fourth common shortcut in judging others is the contrast effect. Now you're evaluating a person's characteristics based on a comparison with other people that you recently encountered. Another way you can relate to this is when someone gives an outstanding presentation, engaging, informative, motivating, and you're thinking, I hope I don't have to follow that. The contrast effect is why you just made that statement. You don't want to be compared to such a great presentation for this common judgment. The last of the common shortcuts in judging others is stereotyping. This is when you judge someone based on your perception of the group to which this person belongs. Stereotypes can be deeply ingrained and powerful enough to influence decisions. So let's talk about decisions. In rational decision making, there are 6 steps that most people follow, either consciously or unconsciously. First, they define the problem or situation at hand. Second, they identify decision criteria. Then they weigh the criteria because some things in life are just more important. Fourth, you develop alternatives. Think of the obvious and then get other perspectives so you can think of other possible alternatives. Then you evaluate the alternatives. Think about what's important to you, how it will impact your life. Consider whether this is a short-term band-aid or it will benefit your life in the long term. Is there data that can help you make a decision? The answers that you have for each of these questions will likely give you direction. And lastly, you select and execute the best alternative. What's interesting is that multiple people can go through the same process and not everyone will arrive at the same conclusion. Some people will only consider the rational thought and what makes sense, disregarding any emotion, and some people rely heavily on intuition. Something to consider are the many biases that will impact your decision. For example, there's an overconfidence bias. When asked, people may say they are 90% confident, but research shows that those decisions are only 50% accurate. Individuals whose intellectual and interpersonal abilities are weakest and more likely to overestimate their performance and ability when they fall in this category. There's also an anchoring bias. This is when you focus only on the initial information and dismiss subsequent information. A confirmation bias is when you selectively gather past information that reaffirms choices and discounts information that contradicts past judgments. The availability bias is when we base judgments on information that is readily available. A workplace example is that if a manager were to give more weight in a performance evaluation to recent employee behaviors or output rather than what occurred over the last 6 to 12 months. Lastly, there's the hindsight bias. This is the tendency to falsely believe that after the outcome is already known, that we would have been able to accurately predict it. An example would be that if Blockbuster would have leveraged their brand for online streaming, they would have avoided failure. While it seems obvious in hindsight, nobody can truly predict industry trends or organization performance. Hopefully you have a better understanding of perception and the link it brings to decision making. If you're interested in learning more about related managerial topics, you can read my book, Rockstar Manager from Theory to Practice at Barnes & Noble, or Judge and Robbins Organizational Behavior. Thanks for your time, be your best you, and be a rockstar manager.